Good evening and welcome to part one in the much anticipated Synergy 516 build video series. My name is Chris Sexton. I'm with Team Synergy, and as you can see here, I've got all the bits and pieces to build the airframe for the new 516 laid out. Not going to do a true unboxing. Those videos tend to be long and tedious, and I want to get right down to the meat of it. But as you would expect from Synergy, everything is in all the assemblies are individually wrapped. Everything has to do with the head is in there. Main gear and main pulley sections in that one. Boom clamps, tail box with tail belt, tensioner, frames. Frames have their own bags as usual. 2mm quality carbon. I'm going to open these up and inspect for any edges that might need sanded. This is a good time to spend good place to spend some time prepping the frame. Make sure there's no burrs, sharp edges. You know, it's an electric, they don't vibrate, but too much. But still a good idea. Help prolong the life of things. I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera and get some parts laid out. We're going to build this guy in manual order. And we are going to start with the main frame sides. Alright, quick note. This is kind of a first for Synergy. The side frames do have a left and right. They're not symmetrical. It's a real easy way to tell. The left side is the side with the hole for the tail servo. So when you're following the manual and you're starting to build your frame halves, make sure you orient things so that the frame half with the tail servo hole is your left side. First thing we have to do with this in step one is get the battery tray, the mount, the canopy post, excuse me, lined up and ready to go. This battery tray does have an upside and a downside. It's really easy to tell on these. The slot for the tray is down, and the notches to clear the bearing blocks is up. It's real easy. So when you're putting this on the frame side, you want to make sure you have the groove in the tray down. I'm going to go ahead and open some stuff up, put the slides in and the post on, and come back and show you the one side done. Alright, there we go. Both frame sides are step one are done. This is actually step one, this is step two. I'm just going to point out a few things. As you can see, the battery tray is there, rail slide down. The tail servo mounts go in this step, as well as the post for the tensioner spring and the left rear canopy mount. And on the other side, we've got the battery slide as well as the right side canopy mount. The next step, I believe, has got me dealing with the bearing blocks. Yep. So we're going to go ahead and get the bearing blocks out of here. I'm going to show you the bearing blocks a little better on the camera, so I'll just open these bad boys up. So, typical Synergy fashion, like a lot of helicopters, you've got three bearing blocks, an upper, a middle, and a lower. Something that's new for Synergy, on the lower bearing block, the motor mount is integrated into the bearing block, so it makes it very easy to tell which one of these is the middle one. One note though, you do want to verify your orientation. Because of the cyclic servo positioning on this helicopter, the bearing blocks definitely have a very noticeable right side up, right side down kind of position. So it would be a little easier to know which one is which. Lots of 2.5mm screws on these. The 10mm main shaft is 10mm main bearing is in there as well. Nice, high quality, beautiful machined aluminum. Lower bearing block. This is pretty typical. Up is the side where the bearing is going to be captured by the auto hub, so that's pretty straightforward. And then the top bearing block is smaller than the middle bearing block. Doesn't have the motor mount in it. The upper main bearing is captured by these two 2mm bolts with washers. We've done away with a collar. If the main gear is shimmed properly, There's no up and down play to need to have a collar help eliminate, and these screws will hold the bearing in place no problem at all. So there is no upper collar on this build. I'm going to go ahead and break the camera, and when I come back I will have the bearing blocks mounted to one side of the main frame. Alright, there we go. All three bearing blocks are loosely fit. Don't actually fully tighten these up until I've got the entire both sides of the frame put together. Then I'm going to take it over onto a level surface and make sure and use my main shaft to help me assist in squaring the frame. This is an important step, getting the frame square so there's no binding on the main shaft. Goes a long way for proper, for prolonged bearing life, and I just think just fit better. It's a square frame is very important. So there, all three are positioned. As you can see, the upper is very easy to identify. I did go ahead and Loctite the two screws holding the bearing in. They had nothing to do with keeping it square. The middle bearing block and the lower bearing block are oriented in such that the bearing cups face the middle. So when the main gear and the auto hub is in there, they will help capture the bearings. And that is one side basically done. The next step isn't to marry the frames. The next step has me building the carbon fiber piece for the boom block, as well as prepping the skid mounts. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the camera. The carbon fiber pieces for this will probably need sanded as well. So when I come back, I will have the boom block assembled and probably already mounted to one half of the frame. This part's pretty straightforward, just like any of the other Synergies you've built. So following instructions is pretty straightforward. And when we come back, I'll have the frame ready to put together. Alright guys, we got this frame about ready to marry. I've got the rear boom block built. 4 Phillips countersunk screws hold the carbon fiber onto the boom blocks. Boom blocks hold onto the main frame with 2.5mm cap screws. What I've got, as you can see, the main bearing blocks are still loose. What I'm going to do, and this is very difficult to do on camera, so I'm not even going to try. I have got the screws all loose. All the screws that have anything to do with holding the side frame on are gone. And I'm going to go and drop a little bit of blue Loctite in all the points that get screws. Then I'm going to loosely attach the right side mainframe. Then I'm going to take my main shaft, go into my kitchen. I have a smooth top glass range. It can be done on granite, marble. You just need something that's nice and flat and smooth. And I am going to tighten all the screws up with the main shaft in place, assuring that as I tighten it up, the main shaft doesn't start binding on these bearings. Again, keeping the bearings square not only increase their life, but also ensure that the entire frame is square, which makes all the fit and finish, everything else much nicer. So this is going to be a long break off cam. When I get back, I'm going to have a complete main frame with a main shaft that falls right through. Alright guys, so as you can see, my main frame is together, and that main shaft will fall all the way through, almost as if the bearings aren't even there. That's what you're aiming for. That is how you know that this frame is square. There's no binding on that main shaft. We're not going to be adding any premature loads to those lateral loads to those main bearings, and they're going to have a nice long healthy life. I also now know that the core of my helicopter is square and ready to go. So the next step is the skid mounts and get it up on its skids. When I come back, we'll have these guys and talk about those. Almost missed a step on you. The next step in the manual is actually to build the front ESC tray. Now this is a particularly important step to pay attention to. There are a lot, well, it looks like four of these standoffs look identical, with one exception. One standoff, spacer rather, has the front canopy posts in it. So you want to be very careful. While the aluminum itself is identical, it doesn't really matter where you put the aluminum. You got to be sure that when you put the ESC tray on the front of the helicopter, you use the canopy post and the appropriate stud to secure the front lower part, because that's where the canopy mounts in the front. So next up, we're going to take these skid struts, and they go right down here on the bottom. and then we'll be ready to put the feet on this lady. Alright guys, here she is. The bulk of the mainframe is complete. Build tip for you. On these front standoffs where the front spacer, lower side ESC tray where the front canopy mounts go, I put red Loctite on these studs and screw them into the spacer and give that a good hour to set up before I put blue Loctite on my caps. It's very easy for this to bind and you end up with more threads on one side than the other, and it's just good tip to get good thread on both the spacer and the standoff, the post rather, is to use red Loctite, run the post in halfway, give it a good hour to cure, and then I only use blue on the actual canopy post, because if I ever need to replace this main side, the blue will break before the red and the post will stay with the spacer. As you can see, I got both of the canopy, the skid mounts, the Lexus blue in there, skid mounts on there. The next step is the actual skids themselves. These are pretty straightforward. Now this is a new shape strut specific to the 516. It's a little bit beefier. They've got the same support ridges like the 766 to avoid that sag that some of the other models have been known to do over time. Matt did stick with the 8mm skid tube, but obviously it is shorter to be appropriate length for the 516. These go together pretty straightforward. Now Matt has changed the design on these with the 766. There's no longer the nut that goes up inside the skid tube. There's comes with some M4 set screws. So what I like to do is put the struts on the helicopter, slide the tubes in, get the helicopter getting set nice and square, and then use CA on the set screw and run the set screw in to tighten it all up with it sitting flat so there's no warping of the tubes. He also did modify the mold on the tube inserts, the plugs. They go in much easier now, so that's nice. So I'm going to go ahead and save you the boredom of watching me build the struts. I'll come back when the struts are done and this bird is sitting on her own feet. Alright guys, there she is. Ready to stand on her own 2 feet. Sits nice and flat. Try not to get too caught up in where the holes are in the skids, in the struts, the tubes. The set screws work really, really well. I prefer to make sure the heli is sitting perfectly square and the tubes are angled in just slightly, little bit of the tip. It looks more like a full-scale helicopter that way. And then snug up the set screws against the tube itself. Sitting nice and straight. Main shaft still falls right through, no problem. We are going to take a break, clear the workbench, and when we come back we'll be talking about the belt tensioner. Alright guys, here we are. As you can see, I have the belt tensioner completely torn down. This is a very, very, very important step. While I've had the pleasure of building 2 of these models, an Alpha and now this production ready kit, both of my tensioners were pre-assembled correctly from the factory, but you don't want to make the assumption. You don't want to be the one guy that has a problem and then you start having belt performance issues or strange noises or things don't line up because you didn't check this. So it's very important. The arm of the tensioner does have a right side up. There is a 2 small bearings in the center. Way out here on this side, the long arm is where the pivot ball goes for the spring. And then on this side, it's really hard to see in the video, but there is a boss here, raised boss, which is meant to contact the inner race on this outer idler pulley. There's no shim between the idler and this arm. If there's a shim there, you could over compress these bearings and have some noise there, or it certainly shortened bearing life. The center pulley, which is flanged to help guide the belt, does have a shim that goes on either side. And then there is a shim because this arm does pivot on the bolt that goes through the center pulley. There is a shim that goes between the head of the screw and the upper arm that captures the top of the center and the top of the outer idler pulleys. So again, pay very close attention to the manual. I recommend a full teardown like you've got here. Reassemble per the manual, just to be sure you've got everything lined up square. Another tip: these pulleys are doing a lot of RPMs. I'm not going to try to guess. It's the same RPM as the tail, basically. You don't want to get Loctite in these bearings. And rather than Loctiting this long screw and then pushing it up through the bearings, what I recommend you do is you add the Loctite to the arm, here for the pivot ball, here for the idler pulley, and then here on the center pivot standoff from the frame, put your Loctite there. Either use a really small 0.5 millimeter Allen hex driver like I'm going to do and wet the inside of the threads, or use a toothpick, but put your Loctite in the receiving threads, not on the bolt. That way, as the bolt pushes through, it pushes the extra Loctite out the bottom, and there's very, very, very little chance of getting Loctite in your bearings. Just a good little tip. I'm going to go ahead and reassemble this tensioner and mount it in the frame. Come back, I'll show you what it looks like. Alright guys, as you can see, the tensioner is now mounted. If you've done your job properly, these pulleys spin super free. They are square, light this up a little bit. They are square this way as well as square this way, and there's no binding on any of these pivot points. The pulleys spin smooth and the arm is free to move. Now I am not going to go ahead and put the spring on. I don't believe in overly stretching the spring this early, and B, when I go to put the belt in, it will be easier to thread through the tensioner without the spring there. So spring's not on there just yet. But there you have it, folks. With the exception of the main rotor head and the gyro plate, the main portion of the frame is complete. Battery tray is ready to go. The motor mount, the bearing plates are in. The tail servo mount is in. The canopy posts are in, front and rear. This constitutes the bulk of the main frame, and that's where we're going to wrap up this first video. Tomorrow we will build the head and the tail and show you how all that works. And hopefully after tomorrow, it'll look like a helicopter. Have a great night, guys.